What time is it? Did you just check your phone? Or your laptop? Or maybe even the kitchen clock? Today it's easy to find out the time down to the precise second if you want to. But have you ever thought about what people did before clocks became widely available? How did ordinary people tell time for, say, in 17th century England? Did everyone just walk around aimlessly? Or were there other methods? Hi, my name is Bose. I have an MA in Early Modern English History, and on this channel we talk about the history you don't learn about in school. And this week we're going to explore some of the methods that people used to tell time in early modern England. We'll specifically look at why people didn't just use clocks and watches to tell the time in early modern England, as well as 3 methods for how people did tell the time, and a bonus 19th century method for telling the time called the knocker-upper. The mechanical clock. Despite the fact that the mechanical clock was invented in around the 14th century, the majority of English households by the early modern era still did not own their own clock. This was because timepieces were considered a luxury item and were unaffordable to many. For example, in 1755 Wrexham, one of England's clock-making hubs, the average price of a long case clock was £2. Now, for some context, your average servant's yearly wage could be about £2 at this time period, or lodgings for a small family, decent, nice lodgings, depending on where you were in England, could cost about £4 a year. So, for the majority of the population, spending £2 on a clock was simply unaffordable. Timepieces as luxury items is really emphasised in 1797, when the Prime Minister of the time, Pitt, placed an additional tax on pocket watches, and also by the fact that 20% of middling men and 16% of middling women only owned timepieces. So even for the middling sort, timepieces were an aspirational, luxury sort of item rather than the norm. However, you still have people using the older, traditional methods of time telling that we're going to talk about in today's video well into the 19th century because of the unaffordable prices of clocks. So, how did ordinary people without a clock tell the time in early modern England? Method number 1, the sundial. A sundial works by having a flat plate with the hours marked out, and then a nonum or a dial, which casts a shadow of the sun as it moves throughout the day, marking out the hour. Sundials are often associated with the ancient world or the medieval era, and this is probably because they were first invented in ancient Egypt. However, what most people don't realise is that sundials were still in use across England throughout the early modern era, and even into the 19th century by many. Even people who owned clocks would actually use a sundial in order to calibrate their clock, until the invention of the pendulum clock in 1656 by Christiaan Huygens, a Dutch inventor. Despite the invention of the pendulum clock, the sundial remained in use because clocks were still inaccessible to many people because of their expense. However, sundials were more likely to be a staple of middling or upper sort homes rather than the average worker. However, many public places would have had sundials, such as in market squares or even churches. In fact, clergymen still used sundials to be able to know the time for their religious practices well into the 19th century, rather than having a clock. Speaking of the church, method number 2, perhaps the most common method used by ordinary people to tell the time, is the church clock. By the 14th century in England, you start to see church clocks appearing on the church towers. And by the 16th century, most of the parishes in England had at least one clock on their church tower. This was visible for everyone in the community who passed the church. For example, in Bristol, there was over a dozen churches that had an external clock that people could see by the 16th century. And many of the churches that didn't have an external clock face would have church bells that would ring out every hour, or quite frequently every quarter hour. So, if you couldn't visibly see the church clock face, you could still hear the time. And you shouldn't underestimate how loud these bells were and how far they could travel without things like noise pollution that we have today, or tall buildings obstructing the sound. In fact, for some of the great churches in the urban areas, such as York Minster, the sound of the bells could travel for up to 8 miles. And even with the small parish churches in the rural areas, the sound could still travel for miles. As a result, historians think that church bells is one of the best ways that people knew the time in early modern England. For example, in the Old Bailey court proceeding cases, one historian has estimated that in 43% of cases, the witnesses have been able to place events within the hour of them happening, and they attribute this largely to being able to hear the church clocks and therefore know an average of what the time is. Method number 3 is the hourglass. Now, you're probably quite familiar with an hourglass, whether you've seen them in a children's board game or just out and about. They work by the sand passing through one side to the other to denote a specific interval of time, whether it's from 1 minute to an hour or even more. And the size of the hourglass and the amount of sand in it affects the time passed. Hourglasses were incredibly popular ways of telling time, interval time that is, in early modern England. They wouldn't tell you if it was 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning, but they were used for interval time tellings to see how long something had been, say, in the oven for, or how long you'd been doing a particular task. Because of this, they do actually become quite associated with women's work, as they were frequently used for cooking. As I said, to measure how long something had been in the oven for. But they are also used in a very public setting by men for timing specific events, such as how long a priest had been doing a sermon for, or how long a lecture was lasting. They were relatively inexpensive, and while they wouldn't have been affordable to the poorest in society, they were staples for many households. For our bonus time-telling device, we're going to stray into the 19th century, where the introduction of shift work in factories required workers to be at the factory for a specific time each morning, which required them to wake up at a specific time each morning. But how do people without alarm clocks, let alone ordinary clocks, wake up at that time in the morning? By the way, fun fact, the alarm clock was invented in 1787 in the USA by Levi Hutchins. However, it would only ring at 4 o'clock in the morning. Not very practical for factory work. So how did factory workers tell the time in order to be able to get to work in time? Well, they used a very simple device. It's not a device really, it's more of a man, called the knocker-upper. Factory workers would employ a knocker-upper who would walk the streets in the morning and would use a long fishing rod-like device to knock on people's bedroom windows 3 or 4 taps to wake them up in the morning at a precise time so that they could then get ready and go to work. Now you might be wondering, so who woke the knocker-upper up so that knocker-upper could wake everybody else up? Well, some knocker-uppers actually employed other knocker-uppers to wake them up. Also, some knocker-uppers actually became nocturnal and would sleep during the day, so they would be awake during the early hours of the morning in order to be able to wake everybody else up. People found a multitude of ways in the past in order to be able to tell time, and we've briefly explored some of those today. It's amazing how keen a sense of time many people had, especially in the urban areas, without ever actually owning their own timepiece or clock. Thank you for watching today's video, and please remember to come back next Sunday for another really random, really interesting video on history. That's all for now. Bye!